So for new members in particular, when individuals apply to join the party, they're invariably either sent or given a package of literature from the party office or from the provincial party office, which includes a copy of our party press, obviously the application card itself, other leaflets and issues of Spark and other publications of the party, and of course the party constitution and the party program. And comrades and applicants are urged to read these over, to study them, and so on. When applicants then have a kind of an interview or a meeting with comrades locally, they're usually asked if they've read the program, if they have any questions or concerns about the program, anything that they disagree with or want further clarification about, and so on. And finally, of course, when new applicants are actually inducted into a party club, these comrades are asked to complete an initiation pledge, which says in part, I accept and will work to the best of my ability to carry out the program and the policies of the Communist Party of Canada as determined by the Constitution and Convention. All of which, if it's not already clearly evident, suggests that the party program for us plays a pretty basic and essential role in the life and the work of the party and its members. It must be said, however, that most members, after having read the program, have a tendency to set it aside and get involved in ongoing party activities, attending club meetings, going to demos and protests, distributing our party press and leaflets, and so on. It's like they check the program off their to-do lists, been there, read that, and get on with their political activism as party members, as communists. This is quite understandable, but it's also a mistaken approach. The program, of course, is not a Bible, it's not a mantra, but neither should it be confined to some corner of your home library to collect dust. Rather, the program is a living, fundamental document for communists, grounding and orienting us. It is analytical, prescriptive, and predictive. It's analytical because it lays out basically a worldview of the socioeconomic dynamics in which we live in Canada and on a global level. It's prescriptive in the sense that it points, in a general sense, the line forward of what we're struggling to achieve and how we need to go about it, what our priorities should be, and so on. And it's also predictive. Sometimes comrades aren't so clear about what we mean by predictive. I mean, obviously, we're not crystal ball gazers. We don't give a whit whether Justin Trudeau's moon, well, I think he's a Capricorn, so his Capricorn moon is in the ascendance phase or not. But it is predictive in this sense. Not only the program, which in many respects is a distillation of the essential theory that we base ourselves on of Marxism-Leninism, but our whole science of Marxism provides us with tools not only to understand what is transpiring today in the world, but also, in a certain sense, to predict where developments will go and what the response needs to be of the progressive forces of the working class in the first instance and of its allies. Let me give you a simple example. We're currently in a profound economic crisis, which will be much more intense and protracted than the pandemic itself. This crisis, of course, was triggered by the coronavirus, but it wasn't caused by it, as we understand it. In fact, is rooted much more deeply in the accumulation of contradictions within the global capitalist system itself, but it has been ignited and brought forward, you could say, as a result of the pandemic. But from our science, we have an understanding about how capitalism and how the ruling capitalist class deals with cyclical and structural crises, which constitute a threat an existential threat, in fact, to their rule, to the capitalist system itself. We know not only on the basis of past experience, but also at a theoretical level, that the capitalist class will, in every circumstance, attempt to protect their own assets and wealth, and to maintain and restore their levels of profitability, and that they will do that at the expense of the working class and oppressed peoples. They will do this indirectly through cuts to funding for social programs, for instance, that are provided by the state. But they also do it directly, right in the workplace, sometimes with savage wage cuts. So if we use the example of the current economic crisis and the depression, which will carry on for quite some time, we know in a general sense what the capitalist class, what ruling circles around the world and here in Canada will attempt to do in terms of extricating themselves from the crisis at the expense of others, at the expense of the vast majority, at the expense of the working class itself. And we know that part of that will include a sharpened attack on the trade union movement, on gains which are already being eroded, but gains that had been achieved over the past century with respect to not only wage levels, but labor protections and labor standards, benefit packages, pensions, and so on. And they will also tend to react by moving towards isolationism, and to try to pit workers from one country against workers in another country, and so on. In other words, to deflect blame for the economic crisis from their own avarice and from their own economic system, to blame others. Not just China, but certainly we know that China is in the crosshairs right now. But in fact, to pit workers in different sectors of the economy and between countries against one another in order to push forward an intensified assault on living standards everywhere. We know that this attack will fall hardest on the unorganized sections of the working class, who will feel the brunt and who have no protection at all from cutbacks in their wages and working conditions. But the attack will also be on the trade union movement, on the organized section of the working class, because the achievements of the organized workers helps to lift up the general wage levels in any particular economy. So if they want to carry out a policy of intensified austerity, it's a polite word for attacks on the working class, they need to attack the trade union movement to break its capacity to resist. Knowing all of that and how the capitalist class will respond or will try to address the economic crisis, we then can draw certain conclusions about what the tasks of the people's forces themselves, the labor movement in the first instance, but also its allies, other mass democratic movements within each country and internationally, in terms of responding to this crisis. Now, we know that this is an inexact capacity to predict the future. We know that unforeseen circumstances, like the pandemic itself, for instance, and also the decisions of individuals, particularly individuals in authority, people like Donald Trump, who is particularly erratic. But in any case, we know that individuals do play a role. But the main direction and course of developments, we can use the tools, identified in the program and in our science of Marxism-Leninism in general, to predict the future, and on that basis to anticipate what needs to be done to advance the struggle for socialism under the changing conditions that we anticipate. And by the way, this capacity to not only analyze what currently exists, but also to anticipate the future tasks of the working class and of the progressive forces is a very essential aspect of what we should be doing as communists. And the program, of course, can be very helpful in that respect. So we need to assimilate the essence of the program and make it our own, guiding our work both in the party and in the mass movements we're involved in. I've been in the party for many decades now, and I have to tell you that I have read over the program, or at least portions of it, particular chapters and so on, dozens and dozens of times over these years. And I will tell you that I get something new out of reading the program every single time that I look at it. It's not because necessarily, could be the case in some instances, but generally speaking, it's not because I missed something the first time I read through it, but rather every time I look at the program and how it analyzes general features within capitalism, the tasks of the people's forces, of the labor movement and its allies, and so on. I then look at the current situation and see how that is playing out in life, and so it's always a new experience. It's always an enriching experience. In any case, let's look more closely at the program itself, its history, its character, and how it relates to our work as communists. So what is the party program? Well, at a risk of gross oversimplification, we could say as a kind of a nutshell characterization, the following. The program lays out the ultimate goal of the party and our strategic line of march to achieve that goal under the prevailing objective conditions. So that's a bit of a mouthful, and even though it's short, I think it'd be useful to think a little bit more about this. First of all, let me just catch up here, that the program projects the party's clearly defined goal to unite and organize and lead the working class in fulfilling its historic mission to end the exploitation of labor and all forms of oppression, which can only be achieved through the revolutionary overthrow of capitalist rule and the building of socialism. Secondly, that the program articulates our strategy in achieving that goal. And third, that strategy is not simply plucked out of thin air, but rather is based on the most rigorous analysis of the objective conditions of struggle prevailing at any given moment in our country. So let's unpack this a bit further. First of all, the program identifies our goal, which we state openly, clearly, for what it is. For instance, you will have noted that in the very first chapter of the program, which is a very short and concise chapter, the final sentence of the program states, the aim of the Communist Party is to establish a socialist and ultimately a communist society in Canada. The party stands for the victory of socialism throughout the world. So anybody who suggests that the party is hiding its politics just needs to be referred to that section. We are very upfront and clear about our goal. That may seem self-evident, but it's useful to just take a moment to talk about the question of the importance, the centrality of the goal that the party sets. Because we often hear, sometimes explicitly stated and sometimes just kind of implicit references to this idea that the goal is less important than the process of what we do to get to that goal. That the destination is less important than the getting there. Well, that's a perspective which we come across frequently, but it's a perspective which, as communists, we reject categorically. It's true that if you're backpacking across Europe, the goal may be less important than the getting there and all the experiences that you have in traveling around around the continent. Same thing, of course, traveling across Canada. But in the circumstances of the socio and economic struggle of the working class and of the popular forces, the people's forces, the goal is absolutely essential. Let's look at a few quick examples. Workers who decide to go on strike don't take that decision lightly. They know that taking job action will involve sacrifices. And even if they have some sort of fund for strike pay, it doesn't come anywhere close to the wages that they are foregoing, the impact that it'll have on their families, on putting food on the table, of paying their mortgages and expenses at the end of each month, and so on. And they also know that taking strike action, if it's not successful, and if the union gets crushed in the process, will lead potentially to retaliatory actions from their employers. So making that decision is not one that is taken lightly. And the only reason why workers, for instance, or let's say the example of landless peasants in Brazil or in Colombia or other countries who take on the local latifundistas, the local landowners, and occupy their farms and so on. Or let's use another example of soldiers in the trenches during World War I who turned their guns on their own officers because they understood that they were being used as cannon fodder in a war which was being fought for imperialist purposes, not for the benefit of the ordinary people, of the workers and the peasants in Russia and in other countries involved in that inter-imperialist conflict, that inter-imperialist war. All of those actions are taken not just because people are desperate, not just to oppose the status quo, but also with an understanding of what they're fighting for. Now, it's not just a question of what we're opposed to, but what we are striving to achieve. So for communists and for the class forces involved in the struggle for fundamental change, the goal is an essential question. It's a primary question. So from the goal, we then start to understand what the strategy is. And the strategy, of course, is what we need to do in a general sense in order to move conditions to achieve our goal of working class power. And the strategy needs to be based on the prevailing objective conditions that exist in each country. Now, as communists, we're internationalists. We struggle for the victory of socialism around the world. But we also understand that there won't necessarily be a worldwide revolution simultaneously in all countries. And that's owing to the imbalances that exist within the global capitalist system and the weak links that appear in some countries at a different rate that they appear in other countries. And so the strategy of revolutionaries and of communists is to fight for state power within each country. But the countries are different. There are different levels of development. They're based on different histories and cultures, and differences in terms of the balance of forces in that society, not only between the two main classes, the working class and the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, but also the role of other classes in various societies. For instance, in Canada, we don't have really a peasant class. We do have small farmers. They constitute probably less today than 1% of the population. Their concerns are important. They need to be addressed in our program, and they find reflection there. But the circumstance in Canada, of course, is much different than in many other countries, particularly in the third world, in the developing world, countries like Colombia, for instance, where there is a massive movement amongst the peasantry against the landowners and whatnot. And the strategy also needs to take into consideration the conditions in which we struggle. For instance, in Canada, we today, even though there's dangers of the rise of fascism, the seeds of fascism are being spread widely, but we still are operating under bourgeois democratic conditions, with elections and consent, even though it's more of a mirage than a reality. But people think that, well, we have a democratic structure and so on. So these are the conditions under which we fight, and we need to develop a strategy in those conditions, which would be, by definition, different than if we were under a fascist dictatorship in Chile, for instance, or after the Pinochet coup in 1973, or in a primarily peasant, excuse me, peasant country like China was back in the 30s, where the Chinese Communist Party developed different tactics of people's war, of the villages surrounding the cities, and so on. In some cases, we were relying on armed struggle, like the Cuban Revolution, guerrilla struggle, and so on. So the strategies are, even though we have the same objective as communists everywhere, to fight for the victory of socialism and ultimately the building of a communist society, the route, the way to the achievement of that revolutionary change in each country needs to be based on a very sober estimation of the prevailing conditions in each country. So from the strategy, then we go to tactics. We often, just as shorthand, talk about strategy and tactics of our movement, of our party. But of course, so we know what the goal is, so we concentrate on strategy and tactics. The point here is that there needs to be a unity between the tactics, the strategy, and the goal. If the strategy does not move us towards the goal, then the strategy is wrong. It needs to be reappraised. It needs to be changed. And similarly, the specific tactics that we undertake in a given circumstance or at a given period of time at a particular election, let's say, or a particular issue that arises in the labor movement or in the people's movements and what have you. If those tactics are inconsistent with our overall strategy, then the tactics need to be, they need to be reviewed. They need to be reappraised and to be changed. So our strategic objective is what the program in particular focuses on. And what is that? Well, first of all, the basics that capitalism has outlived its utility long since, that it is unreformable. And that's not to say that reforms aren't important and we shouldn't struggle for reforms, but that essentially the inherent built-in contradictions of capitalism cannot be solved through reforms, but rather need to come about by the transcending, the overthrowing of the capitalist system and the building of a socialist society in its place. And that in order to achieve that, the working class plays and must play a central role. Why? Because the working class is the main class which is in contradiction, in struggle with the bourgeois class. If we thought for a moment that the dynamics of Canada were being constructed somewhere else, but not coming out of the boardrooms on Bay Street and from the largest monopolies and capitalists, then the question could very well be asked, well, why would the working class be important? But we know, in fact, that the capitalist state, what happens in Ottawa, what happens in Queen's Park, what happens in municipal councils across this country, at every level of the state apparatus, that behind it is essentially the dictatorship of the minority, the dictatorship of the ruling capitalist class. The only class that is in fundamental contradiction and in struggle with the capitalist class is the working class. But it's also because of the size of the working class, its place in the process of production itself. All of these things mean for us that the working class must be the center, must be the core of the struggle for fundamental change, for revolutionary change. But that the working class will need allies in order to achieve that victory. And so our program lays out this conception of building an anti-monopoly, an anti-imperialist alliance, a front, if you will, leading to and finding expression both electorally and also in terms of extra parliamentary struggle in the workplaces, in the streets, and what have you. Culminating is probably not the right word, but leading to the election of a people's government and bringing forward substantive changes which would curb the powers of capital, of the big banks and monopolies, and shift the balance of forces in the interests of the people, putting people before profits. But that will be a period of intense class struggle, and at some point we will reach a juncture where either we go forward to socialism, to full working class power, and to essentially the dismantling of the capitalist state and building a working class state, a proletarian state in its place. Or else that mobilization will be defeated and capitalist power will be restored. This revolutionary process, by the way, is not something that we say is stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. We see it as a single revolutionary process, but one that has different phases in its development. And so that is basically the strategic orientation that our party puts forward in our program. Let's now move to the question of tactics. Let's say, for instance, that we're in a union and a contract comes up for renewal, and the union leadership proposes that we sign this contract that's been negotiated with the corporation, with the bosses. And part of that contract includes a two-tier wage structure, so that younger workers, new hires, for instance, would come in and receive lower wages than the current workers. Why is it that communists would oppose that? Well, it could be said that we oppose it because it's unfair, because it's discriminatory against younger workers, against new workers. All that's true, of course. But the main reason why communists oppose it is that it creates conditions for a deep division within the union itself, within the workplace itself, and more broadly speaking, within the working class, which goes against our objective, which is to unite the working class. And on the basis of a class struggle, a united, militant class struggle trade union movement, to then unite with other progressive and people's forces and to build an anti-monopoly alliance, an anti-imperialist alliance, and so on. So here you have a specific tactic that comes up in your local union. How do we understand that tactic? Well, we have to look at that tactic. Does this help to move towards the strategic goals of the party, which in turn moves towards a goal of achieving socialism? And if that tactic is contrary to the strategic objectives, then we speak up against it. We could look at other examples as well. For instance, if an environmental group, and this, by the way, is not just an abstract question, it actually came up in British Columbia in years gone by and so on, that's concerned about protecting old growth forests and whatnot, launches an assault, and vice versa, by the way, an assault by the IWA right-wing leadership in British Columbia against the environmentalists, the tree huggers, and the environmentalists attacking the union for being in the pockets of the bosses and so on. This is a contradiction. So if we were in that union or part of that environmental group, our orientation should be to say that we are not natural enemies, that we are being pitted against one another by the bosses to serve their own profit interests. And we would be a voice arguing, in fact, that we should be sitting down, having meetings between the environmental group and the trade unions and the workers involved in that industry, finding common ground, building unity, and together taking on the capitalists and their state. And so I hope that kind of clarifies this question of strategy, the goal, the strategy, and the tactics. Now, interesting question. Why do most parties have a party platform but not a party program? You know, the Communist Party is virtually the only party in Canada that has a comprehensive, a detailed party program. And when people apply to join the party and they receive the program, they say, well, boy, isn't this interesting? This political organization actually has a full-blown political program, not just a party platform that they publish before every election campaign and so on. So why is that the case? Why doesn't the Liberal Party have a program, or the Tories, or the NDP for that matter, or the Green Party? Why don't they have actual programs? Well, part of the reason, of course, is that we're a party fighting for substantive, for fundamental change in the socioeconomic system of the country, from capitalism to socialism. This demarcates us immediately from these other parties. The NDP, CCF, and then the NDP came closest to advocacy for socialism, but from early on, they moved from advocating a gradualist road to socialism, that we would fight for individual reforms, good ones, like Medicare and pensions and childcare and so on, and that this accumulation of reforms would then somehow magically transform the social reality from capitalism to socialism. We wake up one day and we say, my God, we're actually living in a socialist country. Well, that we could say reformist road to socialism morphed increasingly into a complete abandonment of socialism as the goal of the NDP, which, by the way, was finalized in 2013 at their convention when they voted to remove the word socialism from the preamble of their constitution. They don't have a program, but they had a semblance of a programmatic position in the preamble of their constitution. And in 2013, they voted to remove that. But that process, as I indicated, started long before that. Back in the late 70s, for instance, Ed Broadbent, who was then the leader of the NDP, came out at a public meeting and said that the NDP had shed the last vestiges of socialism from its activity, from its policies. So it took several more years and decades, in fact, until they finally got up the nerve to say, let's just take it out of the program entirely. But that process, of course, predated it. All right, let's turn to the question of how the program relates to the day-to-day work and the structure of the party. To do that, let's look at the structure, which, if you've gone through the Constitution, you have a general sense of. We start with the Central Convention. The Central Convention meets every 3 years. It's a delegated body of comrades who are elected from the grassroots, from each province and so on. They come to the Central Convention, and we say that the Central Convention is, and we really mean this, by the way, I'm not just saying it, the Central Convention is the highest body in the party. There's nothing which is above the Central Convention. The Central Convention then elects a Central Committee to carry forward the work and to lead the party between conventions. We can't have conventions all the time, they're very expensive. So we have conventions once every 3 years, but at every convention, a Central Committee is elected to carry on the leadership of the party between conventions. That Central Committee elects a CEC, a Central Executive, but the CEC is not over the Central Committee. In fact, the CEC is a creature of the Central Committee and is ultimately responsible to the Central Committee. We also have other bodies like the Appeals and the Audit committees, which are elected at Central Convention. They're different from other bodies that we'll talk about in a moment, because the appeals and the audit committees are elected directly by the convention itself. They are not answerable to the Central Committee or to the CEC. They report directly to the Central Convention. The Appeals Committee deals obviously with issues that members or bodies in the party want to appeal a decision. If that appeal goes forward, ultimately it will go to the Central Appeals Committee, and it will make a decision and make a recommendation to the Central Convention. Similarly, the Audit Committee audits the finances of the party and makes sure that everything is properly managed in the best interests of the party. As a result, neither the Appeals Committee nor the Audit Committee can have anybody on it who is also a member of the Central Committee itself, because it would be a conflict of interest. So these two bodies are elected directly at the Central Convention. The Central Committee also appoints commissions to help the work of the Central Committee and the Central Party. And there's a number of commissions and bureaus: Trade Union Commission, Women's Commission, Indigenous Peoples Commission, Peace and Solidarity Commission, the Cuba Bureau, etc., etc. These bodies are under the direction of the Central Committee. They advise the Central Committee. In some cases, they might help to facilitate the work of our comrades in particular areas of work, trade union work, for instance, or in the women's movement. But they are not autonomous. They are under the direction of the Central Committee, and they report and advise the Central Committee on their respective fields of activity. Then there is the PCQ. The PCQ is an autonomous section of our party, but it is completely integrated into the overall party. The PCQ, of course, is the Parti Communiste du Québec. It is an autonomous entity within our party in recognition of the fact that Quebec is a nation. It's not just one of the provinces. And as a result of that, the PCQ has autonomy over all decisions that relate specifically to politics in Quebec, to their own structure. They can establish their own dues structure, for instance, and so on. They have their own congresses or conventions. They elect their own national committee and subcommittees and so on. And of course, they have their own branches. In Quebec, they're called cells, party cells. And then we also, of course, have provincial committees elsewhere, in Ontario and BC and Alberta, the Atlantic Committee and what have you. And each of these committees, of course, are elected at provincial conventions, and in turn lead the work in each province. And under that, of course, are the clubs. Sometimes there's also regional committees. For instance, in Toronto, we have a Toronto Club Council, which plays a kind of an intermediary role between the provincial committee, the Ontario Provincial Committee, and the clubs in the GTA area. But in general, we have provincial committees and clubs. And of course, underlying it all, of course, is the party membership as a whole. Now, this looks very hierarchical. And certainly our party is a centralist democratic, we're based on democratic centralism. But it is not hierarchical in the sense that our constitution and our program guarantee inter-party democracy and the rights of all party members under the Constitution to not only express their views, to criticize decisions and the actions of leaders, but also, when they feel it appropriate, to overrule the Central Committee and convene a central convention of the party to sort out difficulties or resolve differences or splits in the party, that sort of thing. But of course, this map of the structure of the party leaves out two very important components. I said at the outset that the Central Convention is the highest body of the party, but even the Central Convention is bound by two fundamental documents, the Constitution and the program. What do I mean by this? Well, the Central Convention, even though it's the highest body of the party, has to respect the Constitution of the party, and it can't make political decisions which are contrary to the program of the party. If the Central Convention, for instance, for unforeseen circumstances, like an airline strike or a pandemic, can't convene and has, it ends up violating the requirement of the Constitution that the convention be held every 3 years, so it has to be postponed because of these circumstances. One of the first pieces of business when the Central Convention does convene is to approve this departure from the Constitution. If it's an issue that either the Central Committee or the convention itself or the membership feel isn't just a kind of a one-off circumstance, like a delay in the convening of a convention, but that there's problems with the Constitution itself, they must then start a process to amend the Constitution, which can only be done at a Central Convention. The same thing goes for the program. Now, both the Constitution and the program, they don't have adjudicators. They don't have some sort of independent structure or gatekeeper to make sure that the Central Committee and the Central Convention and so on abide by the Constitution and the program. They're documents, after all. It's the party membership that must uphold the integrity of these documents. It's the party membership that needs to say, wait a minute, there are violations, and the repeated violations of our Constitution being carried out by leading bodies or by even the convention itself, and so on, or departures from the political line of the party as expressed in the program, the party program. It's the party membership which ultimately is not only the base of the party, but also is we say in French, the responsables, the ones who are responsible to ensure that the party not only abides by its rules, but stays on track in terms of the political orientation and outlook of the party. So let's turn to some further questions about the program. Is the program written in stone? Well, obviously it's not. And in fact, the program of the party has been updated, in some cases virtually rewritten, on many occasions over the past 100 years. The party, of course, was founded in 1921, and at that founding convention of the party, it adopted a program. It was subsequently changed and updated in the 30s. Certainly, when the party faced repression and illegality, it was changed again when the party was essentially driven underground, and the Labor Progressive Party took its place as a semi-legal political organization. It was changed again in '59, a particularly important convention of the party that updated and developed our analysis, particularly with respect to Quebec's status as a nation within Canada, not just as one of the 10 provinces, and so on. And then again in 1971, there was a major overhaul of the program. That program then stayed in place for a number of years. There was a process undertaken in the late 80s, in 87 and 88, to further update the program, to bring it, and in every case, the purpose for updating the program is to ensure that the program reflects the prevailing objective conditions at the time in the country, and accordingly to make adjustments to our strategic line, our way forward. That process in the late 80s was, and by the way, most members didn't realize this at the time, but it was tabled, it was postponed primarily because there were sharpening divisions within the party at that time, which ultimately led to a split in the party. And when the party reorganized in the early 1990s, we understood, given everything that had happened internationally, including, of course, the overthrowing of socialism in the former Soviet Union and in most of the socialist countries in Eastern Europe, that it was necessary, for a whole number of reasons, for us to do a significant update to the program. And we began that process in the early 90s as we started to rebuild the party after the crisis. But we didn't want to rush that process, and it took several years, discussions around different theses, what should be included and prioritized in the new party program and so on, and eventually culminated in 2001 at our convention, which adopted what is essentially the current program. But like anything, the program cannot be allowed to ossify, right? To be, in that sense, written in stone, and become dated and out of touch with the current situation and the needs and tasks of the party and of the working class and of the people's movements more broadly. And so we started again a process of reviewing the 2001 program, which culminated last year at our convention with the adoption of a whole number of additional amendments, which now have been finalized. Many of them were referred to the incoming Central Committee. It took some time to sort through it all, and the pandemic didn't help either. But in any case, the new amended and updated program is now out. It's on our website. It's on our Facebook page and so on. And hopefully, this is the one that you have, or if you don't have it, you should certainly get it and see what changes, what additions were made, because they were fairly substantial, dealing with a number of issues, changes in the composition of the working class, on the environment, on our understanding of the indigenous people's struggles and the history of colonialism and colonial and genocidal plunder of the First Nations in this country, and on a whole number of other questions as well, on some of the international economic dynamics and what have you, on the question of fascism. So the whole number of additions and changes that were made at our last convention. So in a certain sense, we could say, is it written in stone? Yes, it's written in stone because it is the law of the party. The current program is the line of the party. In that sense, it is written in stone, but of course, it's a living document, not one that is, is written 2,000 years ago and can't be changed and so on and so forth. And that's why, of course, it is updated, reviewed, and changed from time to time. Of course, doesn't mean that every single convention of the party will have the program on its agenda and will continue to make amendments to the program. This is not only for practical reasons, because every time we change the program, we have to reprint it, and it costs a lot of money, and so on and so forth. But it's also because unless it's a cornerstone issue, which absolutely must be addressed immediately or quickly, we need to ask the question, does the program still essentially serve the purposes for which it's designed and to which it serves? And if the answer is yes, but we note that, well, there's concerns about this particular formulation on page 42 in chapter 3 of the program, and so on. Well, when these questions start to accumulate and we see, okay, so this is now a time where we really do need to do a thorough update of the program, a party review commission is struck, and the wheels of motion are set. And so that's how and when it is changed. The program cannot be changed anywhere else but at a central convention of the party. And we have a standing procedure in the party. I'm not sure that there's actually a constitutional requirement in the constitution of the party, but it's certainly a standing procedure that while we have at least a 3-month discussion period for other political documents, for the political report from the outgoing Central Committee, for other reports that come before conventions. If there are proposals to change the program and the Constitution, they must be elaborated and circulated to the entire party almost a year ahead of time, so that there's a full year for the party membership, for every club to pore over the program, the amendments, and so on, to consider new amendments and to put those forward democratically. And I can tell you that at the last convention, there were a whole series of amendments, not only those proposed by the outgoing Central Committee and its program commission, but almost 200 amendments that came in from various clubs and provincial committees and commissions of the party as well. Now, are members expected to abide by the program? Yes. Yes, they're expected to abide by the program. It doesn't mean, however, that, so we can't cherry pick. We can't say, well, I agree with this part of the program, so I'm going to respect that. I disagree with that, so I'm going to ignore that. No, the program is a collective basis for the unity of the party. And so while members are expected to abide by the program, it doesn't mean, however, that they're not able to criticize aspects of our program. And that criticism can take place at different levels. We don't normally expect comrades to take to social media, to their Facebook page, for instance, to go on a rant against this or that formulation in the party program, although they're permitted to do that. But for the most part, it happens within the party itself, within our clubs, within various levels of the party, where comrades say, you know, there's a problem with this aspect of the program or that aspect of the program. We really need to change it. And so absolutely, members have a right to criticize the program as a whole or certain aspects of the program. And obviously, if enough of the membership agree with that criticism, then that will be reflected in the delegates that are elected to provincial conventions and to the central convention and so on. Okay, finally, let me turn to some of the specifics, features of the program itself. I'm going to run through this quickly because I think we're probably running, let me just see here. Yeah, we're running late. So presumably you've all read the program. There's a very short introduction. It's a kind of a thumbnail sketch, but it's no replacement for reading the whole program. But it's a very good and powerful introduction into the rest of the program. Then there is a very long chapter, Capitalism in Canada, which basically lays out our analysis of what exists and how it came to exist. Its development from a British colony, and obviously the situation even before colonization, and so on. We go into more detail about that in the fourth chapter, dealing with the nations in Canada. But it's also referred to in chapter 2. The development of monopoly capitalism and then state monopoly capitalism. We make the point that capitalism in Canada is certainly dependent on US imperialism, but it is not a dependency. It is an imperialist country in its own right. It has a developed Canadian capitalist class, which is the main enemy of the Canadian people, and so on. So it's a very comprehensive chapter, and it talks about also the environment, crisis in social conditions, and what have you. Then we have chapter 3, which talks about, obviously, Canada within the world imperialist system, and some of the dynamics taking place internationally. The fourth chapter deals with a number of things, primarily, as I indicated before, with respect to nations and peoples of Canada and our approach to the national question and our democratic solution that we put forward to the crisis of confederation. So I would say that that's probably 80 to 90% of chapter 4, but we also deal with the Canadian state, the role of the state apparatus, particularly the repressive apparatus of the Canadian state, and of course to the crisis of democracy, so-called democracy, bourgeois democracy, and how in fact how that stands in juxtaposition to socialist democracy, which is what we fight for. Chapter 5, a real cornerstone chapter, which puts forward our views about our strategic line. So what are the class forces that we need to unite and move into action, move into struggle, centered on the working class itself, and particularly its most organized section, which is, of course, the trade union movement. What kind of trade union movement do we need to struggle for, and so on. And then what the relationship is between the working class and its organized detachment, the labor movement, and other people's struggles for democratic rights, for gender equality, around the environment, for housing, a whole number of other issues, and how they are part and parcel of threads which need to be brought together into a united struggle for anti-monopoly reforms, and ultimately for fundamental change for socialism. Chapter 6, which was a shorter chapter, but nevertheless talks about our immediate goal of forming a people's government, which by definition would be a transitional government. It would be a government based on the vast majority, the working class and its allies, but still operating under conditions of capitalist rule. Would take actions to curb the power, to restrict the power of monopoly, of the banks and of the corporations, would extend people's democratic rights, would shift not only the economic, but the social and political balance of forces in the country, and what have you, and would create the conditions, open the door, if you will, to fundamental, to revolutionary change. It would not be socialism. And we understand that there won't be a smooth transition. It will be a very rocky period of intensified class struggle, but the revolutionary change, that is to say, the seizure of state power and building a working class power, that of course is what our main objective is, to build socialism, which of course is covered in chapter 7. Chapter 7 has a whole section at its beginning which looks at the experience of socialism in the former Soviet Union. Back in 2001, well, through the 90s and 2001, that was a particularly important question because, in fact, we had to contend with the fact that lots of people, including progressive-minded workers, were under the impression that socialism just didn't work. Look, it failed in the Soviet Union. It's not possible. So we needed to address that question and explain what had happened in the Soviet Union. And then on the basis of that, to then put forward what kind of socialism we are advocating for Canada, how socialism would manifest itself in Canadian conditions. Now, this question about the first part of Chapter 7, that's an interesting question. Do we still need it in our program? Well, an argument could be made both ways. The defeat of socialism internationally from the 90s is still very much au courant. It's still an obstacle which we need to contend with and which we need to address. Does it need to take up as much space in the program as we go forward? Well, I think that will be an interesting discussion, and perhaps when we do another update of our program, we will look very carefully at that question. And finally, of course, there's the Communist Party itself in Chapter 8. This is how we self-identify as communists and as a party. A party which is a revolutionary detachment of our class, but not separated from it, and that the Communist Party has no interests separate and apart from the interests of the working class as a whole. That we base ourselves on revolutionary theory of Marxism-Leninism. That is our class internationalist basis of our theory and practice. It talks about the fact that the Communist Party stands for reforms, but we are not reformists, and that we see a relationship between reform and revolution, a dialectical relationship. And that while we work for unity with other forces, and we're always open to advance the process of unity, that there is an important need for the Communist Party to defend its political independence and autonomy as a working class revolutionary party of the working class, and talks also about our internationalist character and so on. So it's basically laying out, this is the party, this is our analysis, this is our way forward, and this is how we see our role in that larger struggle. So that basically is what the program is made up of. Just a few quick final thoughts. Even though the program is divided into 8 chapters, and in some cases subsections within those chapters, and even though every single paragraph, every sentence is rich with analysis and postulations for action, for struggle, it's not just a collection of interesting and progressive concepts and theses. The program must be seen as an integral, as a dialectical whole, a worldview guiding our work as communists, as revolutionaries. And I hope that you come to see the program in this light and to use it as a tool in the struggle for fundamental change for socialism. Thank you.